Well, hello. It is 1 o'clock on a Wednesday here in Boston and Burlington, Massachusetts. And welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. Today, I am very excited to have Selwyn Rabins, who's our president, head of technical development, and also co-founder of Alpha Software, who's with us today to talk about the newest release of Alpha Anywhere, versions 4.5.3 and versions 4.5.4, both of which have come out over the last couple of weeks. If you have any questions during today's session, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel, and I will interrupt Selwyn from time to time to ask him questions. So let me take Selwyn off mute here. Hello, Selwyn, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Dave.
Excellent. And I've gone ahead. You're already presenter, so if you want to share your screen, I'll let you know when that appears. And there it is. All right, we're ready to get started.
Okay, great. Dave, thanks very much, and welcome, everybody. I'm very excited to be talking to you all today about the new features in the latest releases of Alpha Anywhere. So this latest release has quite a lot of features in it, and so what I've done today is just selected a few of the features that I think are sort of the more important features, and I'm going to basically go through discuss each of those features in a little bit more detail. So the features from this release that I'd like to focus on today are the REST API builder. So I'm going to demo the REST API builder and also talk a little bit about what a REST API is and why you would want one. Then we're going to talk about the new Xbasic SQL Genies and what they do and why we did them. We'll talk about the new SQL Audit feature that allows you to keep track of all of the changes that anybody makes to data in a SQL database. For those of you who are building mobile applications and are using PhoneGap, we're going to talk about the PhoneGap Instant Update feature and why we think this is going to make developing PhoneGap apps easier and certainly less painful. We'll talk about the new advanced date formatting options, some new features in maps that actually aren't out right now but will be out next week, and then finally Salesforce Integration. So first, let's focus on REST APIs. So initially, when we first started talking internally about REST APIs, I sort of wasn't quite sure that I got what everyone was so excited about REST APIs about. But in fact, REST APIs are actually incredibly useful. And one of the ways of thinking about a REST API is that it gives programmatic access to the functionality that you've built into your application. So you can think of a REST API as a website that does not have a user interface. In other words, basically the functionality in this website is going to be accessed by a program, not by going through the user interface, and it's going to be accessed by making an HTTP request against your website. So the goal of building an API is to give other programs access to the functionality in your application. So I often think that it's useful to sort of talk about a sort of a real world scenario that describes the motivation for putting a REST API into your application. So the example that I use is, let's say that you've built an application where a user can go to a website and sign up for an appointment. So they might go to a URL, and then when they hit that URL, there'd be a form that asks them, say, maybe their name and address and the date of the requested appointment, and then maybe the person who they'd like to have the appointment with, etc. And then after you've collected all this information in the user interface, there would obviously be a submit button. You'd hit the submit button. That would be an AJAX callback. And then in the AJAX callback, you're going to have code that you've written on your server-side event handler that basically checks to see whether they've filled in all of the required information and possibly whether the person who they've requested the appointment with is available on that date, etc. And then once all of those checks have been completed, you'll actually go ahead and enter a new record into the appointments table and maybe send out an email to the person confirming that the appointment was set up, etc. But all of that has to be done by a person actually visiting your website and interacting with the user interface in your application. But what if you wanted to basically make that same functionality available programmatically, perhaps to, say, another application written in PHP or Node, etc.? Well, in order to do that, you'd need to basically expose that functionality, the make an appointment functionality, as a REST API. And that's exactly what the REST API builder in Alpha Anywhere does. It allows you to take functionality that you've developed in your Alpha Anywhere application and expose it to other programs. So what we're going to do now is actually dive into a demo of the REST API builder and show how you go about doing that. So the first thing to remember is that the REST API exposes functionality that you've previously created in your application. So obviously, the most common way in which you create functionality in an Alpha Anywhere application is by writing some server-side code, and typically that would be done using Xbasic. So the way the REST API builder works is you create some functionality using Xbasic, and that functionality is created as an Xbasic class. And then you basically take all of the methods in the class that you've just created, and you decide which of those methods you'd like to expose using the REST API. So let's go out here now and start out by creating an Xbasic class. So I'm going to go over there, and I'm going to create a brand new class. So I'll go there and say new, and I'm creating an Xbasic class over here. And I'm going to start out by just basically inserting a sample class definition. So you can see here we've created a sample Xbasic class. It's called my sample class, and it's in a namespace called my namespace. And currently this class just has one method called simple method, and what this does is it returns a value. So let's go here, and I'm just going to go ahead and let's actually cancel this. I'm going to cancel it and change the name to my class 2 because I already have a class called that. And so let's go ahead now and save it. So this is going to be my sample class 2. Go ahead there and save it. And I'm going to go and add one more method to the sample class here. I'll say function and sample method 2 as P. I'll make it return an object, as opposed to, you can see this first method just returned a character value. And I'm going to have it take an input as name as C. And then I'm going to go here in my class and just define some very simple functionality. I'll just go here and say dim P as P dot result equals hello plus name, and then P dot error equals false. And then I'm going to return this P object from this method. So I'll go there and say sample method over there, and then go here and say equals P. So at this point, what I've done is I've defined an Xbasic class that has two methods, and I can use this Xbasic class anywhere. I don't have to expose it as a REST API. So I can just as easily go now to my interactive window and test this Xbasic class. So I can go here and say dim pp as, and then there's an instance of that class, and now type pp dot, and then sample method 2, and then type in, say, Fred, and we can see that basically what we get back from this method is hello Fred and error equals false. So we now have a very simple Xbasic class that has two methods, and now we'd like to go ahead and create a REST API that exposes these methods. So I'm going to go back to the control panel now and go over to Web Services, and I'm going to go say New, and I'd like to now create a new definition to create a REST service. So I'll go ahead and click that. And now basically I'm in the REST API builder over here, and I can choose the class that I'd like to expose methods from. So I'll go there and say Add Class, and there's the new class that I just created. And we can see that this class currently has two methods in it. And the little red icon here indicates that neither of these two methods are currently exposed in this REST API. So I'm going to go ahead and expose both of them. So I'll double click there and say I'd like to expose this method, and I'd like it to be a GET. So when you make a REST request, you can choose the verb that you want to use. So it can be a GET or a PUT or a delete or any of these methods. So GET is typically used when you're just requesting information, and POST is most commonly used when you're updating information. So we're going to just go here and say GET, and then we'll also go ahead now and expose this method, and we'll also choose a GET. Now that you can see now that this method, sample method 2, has an argument called name, whereas this method here doesn't even have any arguments at all. So when a method has arguments, as this one does, you can choose whether the REST call puts the arguments in the query string, or whether it puts it in the URL itself, or whether it puts it in the post body. So in this case, since we haven't specified anything, it's going to be in the query string. So let's go now and save this. We'll call this REST2, and then go ahead now and hit save. And then we can go ahead now and test it. So I'm going to go now and do a live test of this API. So remember that an API is just like a website that doesn't have a user interface. So when you're building objects in Alpha that do have a user interface, like a UX or a grid component, you can do a live test from within the builder. And the same thing is true of an API. You can do a live test of the API by clicking on this button over here, and you'll see that the live test opens up. We're in our browser right now, and we can go ahead now and test this first method in our API. So I'll go there and say, test this method. So I'll say, try it out, and then I'll press execute. And we can see here that we get our return value, the return value from sample method 1. If I go now and test out, say, the second method over there, actually, what's going on here. So let me just rerun this page, and then, okay, so there we have. So I'll try it out, and now you can see now it's asking for my name. So I'll just type in, say, Fred, hit the execute button, and you can see now basically we get hello Fred, and then the result equals false. And this is the URL of this REST API. So if you had a PHP program or a Node program or any other program, and you wanted to access this sample method that was written in your Alpha application, this is the curl command that you would use in order to access that method. So at this point, I've actually created an API. It's a very simple API that has two methods in it, one of which basically takes no arguments, and the other one which takes an argument called name, and that argument is part of the query string here. You can see it's got question mark, name equals Fred. But we can change how the arguments are passed to the method. So for example, if I go back to the API builder here, and I say that I want to change the way that we pass that argument in, I can say edit the path and then insert argument over there. And we can see now that we basically changed the way this API is going to be called, because we now have the argument name as part of the path. So we'll go ahead now and save this again, and now go back to our live test. And now you can see when I go here and I test this, try it out, and I'll type in, say, John this time, and then hit execute. If we look now at the URL, we can see now that the argument is part of the URL. It's not part of the query string anymore. So when you're building your REST APIs, you can choose how the API is constructed. You can choose whether the arguments are passed in the query string, in the URL body, or in the URL itself, or in the post body, etc. So in this case, basically, this has been an API that simply requests information and returns it. But you can also do APIs that write information back into, say, a database or into the file system or something like that. So let's go back now and edit our class and add a new method that is going to write information into the file system. So we'll go now and we'll edit our class. So we'll go back to Xbasics. We'll go here to our second class over there. And now let's go ahead and add a third method. So we'll go here and we'll say basically function sample method 3 as P. And we'll say that this particular method takes two arguments, say first name as C and last name as C. And then we'll say that whatever the user types into these two parameters gets saved into a file. So I'll basically go here and say dim file name as C, file name equals C colon data say file1.txt, and then I'll say dim message as C, and then message equals you entered and then we'll save that to the file. So file that from string, and then the file name will be file name, and the string that we type in is message. And then we'll create our return value. So I'll say dim p as p.error equals, say, false, and then p.result equals message. So now we basically created a slightly more complex method that's going to create something in the file system. It could just as easily here be updating a SQL database, but just to keep it simple, I'm just going to write to the file system. So we have our new method over here. Let's go ahead now and save it, and we'll go back now to our REST API definition. So I'm just going to go now back to our web services. Here's REST number 2. And now you can see we have our new method there that is not currently exposed. So we'll basically double click on it and we'll say expose it. And this time we'd like to use a post. So, and you can see here that we specified that the post body will be JSON encoded. We could also choose form encoded, in which case basically we would be prompted for both individually the first name field and the last name field using a query string format. So, but I'm going to just keep JSON encoded. Go ahead there and click the save button, and now go ahead now and run this. Let's go here and test this out. So you can see here is our post body. So we'll say try it out, and we'll go here to first name and type in, say, Fred, and then last name we'll type in Smith, and then hit the execute button. So we can see now that basically, oh, I forgot to return the value. But if we go now and look inside the data folder, we should see a file there called file1. So if we go now and look at file1, so type file1.txt, you can see that you entered Fred.Smith. So what we've shown over here is how you can create a REST API that gets called with a post. And you can see here is the curl command that executes the post against this endpoint. And this is the post body over here, defined over there. So the ability to create REST APIs allows you to easily take functionality that you developed in your website and expose it programmatically to other applications. And it's a way of really sort of extending the reach of your applications. So now moving on, let's move on now to basically the Xbasic SQL Genies. So one of the things that we often found in sort of listening to what many Alpha Anywhere customers were doing is they were trying to basically write server-side code in Xbasic that did updates against SQL databases. And the syntax for writing SQL commands wasn't always that easy for people to discover. So we decided to make a Genie that will generate SQL CRUD statements. So let's go and take a look at that. So in order to try that out, I'm going to go over to Xbasic, and create a new Xbasic function library where I can just basically go and sort of test Xbasic statements. So I can go here in this function library, write some Xbasic code, and then click the run button to actually test it out. So let's say that I want to write some Xbasic code that is going to go and do a query against a SQL table. So I'm going to right click and then go over here to Genies. And then you can see that in the Genies, there's a new Genie here called Xbasic SQL Action Code Generator. And we have all sorts of different SQL actions that you can do. So you can do SQL queries that return JSON data. You can do updates, inserts, and deletes. And then you can also do SQL queries that return hierarchical data. So hierarchical data would be, for example, a JSON object that has a list of customers, and then for each customer, all of the orders for that customer, and then for each order, all of the order details for each particular order. So you can basically use this Genie to write some pretty complex Xbasic SQL queries. So let's just start out by saying we'd like to do a SQL update, and we'd like to update, say, a record in the customer table from the Northwinds database. So I'll choose that, and you can see now the Genie opens up. So the first thing it asks me for is my query string, so I'll say Northwind. So now I'm going to basically be generating an update against the Northwinds, and then I'm going to go ahead now and choose the table that I'd like to update. So I'll choose, say, the customers table. Then I can choose the fields I'd like to update. So let's go here and change the contact title. And I'll go there and put in the value. So I'll go there and say contact title is equal to, say, manager. And then I'll basically specify which record I'd like to update. I'll say I'd like to choose the record that I want to update by the primary key. And I'll go there and type in the name of the primary key that I want to update. And then you can see now that basically that Alpha has generated the Xbasic code now that's going to do an update against the customer table. So by using the Genie over here, I can automatically generate some, Xbasic code that certainly for experienced Alpha developers is easy to write, but for new developers might be somewhat challenging. So I can copy this code to the clipboard. What I can also do is save these settings for future use. So I can go here and save update 1 so that I can get back to the Genie very easily and click OK now. And so now I can just go here and paste this code in. And of course, I can go ahead and run it. And now we've gone ahead and we've updated the contact title for the customer called Bollard in the Northwinds customer table. So obviously you can use this Genie as a starting point, and then you can continue to modify the generated Xbasic code yourself. And one of the more powerful things is the ability to write queries that return hierarchical data. So let's go ahead now and kill this and go back into the Genie. So we'll go back here into the Genie. And this time we're going to basically choose a SQL query that returns hierarchical data. So we'll go there and we'll say, again, we'd like to go to the Northwind database, the Northwind connection string, sorry. Actually, let me just cancel out of there and get that right. So we'll choose Northwind over there. And then we'll say that our top level query is going to go against the customers table. And we'd like to choose customer ID, company name, city, and say country. Click OK. Then we'd like to add a child query to go get all of the orders for that customer. So now we'll go there and we'll choose our orders table. And we'll choose the columns that we want. So we want order ID, customer ID, employee ID, and order date. We'll call this query orders. And then we'll link this query to the parent query on the customer ID field. So there's our linking fields, customer ID and customer ID. And then we can preview this. So we'll see there's our customer, and there are all of the orders for that customer. but we haven't yet added in the order details for each order. So we'll go back now and we'll add another query. And this time we're going to go against the order details table. And again, we'll go and choose certain columns. And then we'll call this query, say, order details. And this time we're going to be linking on the order ID field. So go there to order ID, hit preview, and you can see now we have the customer, we have the first order, we have for this order, we have these line items, then the next order has one line item, etc. So, and then if we look at the generated code over here, let's just copy that code to the clipboard and inject it into our code there. We can see that Alpha has written the Xbasic code for us to do this hierarchical query. So the SQL Query Genie makes it much easier to write Xbasic code that does SQL CRUD statements and in Xbasic. So let's go back to our overview right now. So the next thing I'd like to point out is SQL Audit. So a common requirement in applications that you develop is to keep track of who made changes to what field in what table, and what the old value and what the new value was before the change was made, etc. And auditing changes to a SQL table can certainly be done at the database level by inserting triggers into the database, but you don't always have permission to insert triggers, and sometimes even writing those triggers can be quite challenging. So we've made it really easy now to audit changes to a SQL database. So I'm going to go here, go back to my Web Projects control panel, and you can see now we in our projects property here, we have a new entry here called an audit table. So you can decide whether you want to keep track of changes that are made through a grid in the UX component. If you choose that, then you can specify where this audit table should be stored. So you can see that I've specified the connection string to the database where I want my audit table. And then I can go ahead now and actually create the audit table. So I'll go there and I'll open this up. I'll say I'd like to create an audit table called audit table 2. And since I don't already have a table there, I'm going to just go ahead here and say create the table. And it's going to go ahead now and create a new table for me in this connection called audit table 2. So let's go ahead, close that down. And now, since we haven't made any changes to the database, audit table 2 should be empty. So let's go and take a look now in my MySQL database. So here's my MySQL database over here. And I'm going to just do a refresh there. So there's audit table 2. And you can see that currently there are no records in this audit table because we haven't yet made any changes to the database. So I'm going to go now and let's go back to the web control panel over here. And you can see that in this web control panel, I've got a UX component over here that is based on the customer table in Northwinds. So I'm going to go there and make a change. I'll change that from, say, manager to owner. And I'll change the city from Bonn to Berlin. Go ahead and hit save and then hit the synchronize button to write the data back into the database. And now I'm going to go over to my audit table and hit refresh. And we can see here that we have basically one record in the audit table that's telling us here that basically we made a change to the customer table. The change was made from the UX component called UX customer list. And if I look here in the form view, if I look here at the data, I can see here that we changed the contact title field from owner to from manager to owner. The change was made by an unknown person because I'm not currently logged into the security framework. But if I was logged into the security framework, it would have the name of the logged in user. And it also, of course, has the time when that change was made. So we've made it really easy, as you can see, to audit changes that you make to a SQL database. And these changes that are audited if the update is done through either a UX component or a grid component. So if I go back now to, say, grid view, you can see there's only one record right now in that table, but I'm going to go now over to a grid now and make a change over here in the grid component. So we'll go over now into working preview here, and let's go and change this from, say, Bath to London. Go ahead and hit the submit button, and now go back to our audit table and then hit the refresh button over there. Now you can see we have a second update, and this was made using the grid component called grid customers. Now, of course, if you make an update to a table by using your own SQL, then unless you actually do something specific, it wouldn't be tracked in the audit table. So if you go and take a look now at this sample code that I have over here, let's go back to Xbasic and then go, I think this is audit table test. You can see here we have a SQL statement that's being executed to update a value in the customer table. And we've added code over here to write data into the audit table. So you can see now, if I go ahead and I run this here to do an update using custom Xbasic code, so I've just gone ahead and done that now. And now if I go back to my audit table and do a refresh, excuse me, we can see that there's a new record in the audit table that basically says it was updated by Xbasic, because that's the comment that I wrote into the function that updates the audit table. So the ability to now audit the changes that are made to a SQL database is very easy to implement and certainly can be quite useful in many applications. So let's go back now and take a look at the next feature that I'd like to focus on, which is the PhoneGap instant update feature. Excuse me. So one of the things about building mobile applications with PhoneGap is that, as you know, when you build the application in Alpha, you then have to submit the application to the PhoneGap, excuse me, to the PhoneGap build service before you can actually install the app on your mobile device. So with Instant Update, after you've done the initial build, you can iterate your application extremely quickly by doing an instant update, and this avoids having to go back to the PhoneGap build service. So what I'm going to try to do right now is actually show my phone, reflect my phone onto the screen, if I can get that working. Okay, so here we have it. And I've got an application that I previously built over here called IA Demo number 1. So this app has been built and then sent to the PhoneGap build service, and now it's been installed on my phone. And you can see that when I load it, basically it's got a green screen over here and it says version number 3. So let's go back to this application right now. So we'll go over here to my instant update demo. And what I'm going to do is, that you can see it's obviously a very simple application. I'm going to change the background color of the panel to, say, this pink color. And then I'm going to go here and change the text from version 3, say, to version 4. Go ahead and save it now. And now, instead of having to go back to the PhoneGap build service and regenerating it, I can just go ahead now and actually, okay. Actually, I need to go back to default over there, sorry. So let's go there to, that's the, oh, I think I've messed this up here. So let's see now if I go back to my phone. So I'm going to basically close the app and then restart it. And you can see now we basically have a new version of the application. So let's just go ahead now and do that one more time. So I'm going to go back here to Instant Update. and change this now from version 4 to, say, version 5. Hit the OK button, hit the Save button, go back to the Web Control Panel here, hit the Instant Update button. So that goes ahead and publishes the instant update. Go back to my phone right now, exit the application, restart it, and we can see now that we've updated to version 5. So with Instant Update, you can basically iterate really quickly with your mobile without having to go back to PhoneGap build every time you make a change to the application. So the first time you start out with a new, what's called baseline application. So you can see now that if I go here and start out with a new baseline build, we get to the standard PhoneGap Genie screen over here, but you can enable instant update over here. So I'll say yes. And then when I build the app right now, I'm building what's called a baseline application. Once I've built the baseline application, then I can do instant updates really quickly. And what I can also do, which is really nice, is I can go back. Once I've started using instant update, I can roll back to a previous version. So I can say there, roll back, for example, to version number 3 and click OK. And now when I go back now to my phone and I reload the application, so let's go now into the phone and kill the application and now reload it, you can see we're going to instantly go back to version number 3 of the application. So instant update is a great productivity boost for people who are building mobile applications using PhoneGap. So let's go back now to the list of features that we want to show. And the next thing that I'd like to do is talk about advanced date formatting. So we've always had pretty good date formatting in Alpha, where you can display dates using either month, day, year, or year, day, month format, etc. But advanced date formatting lets you use friendly names and also relative names. So let's go now and talk about, say, first of all, formatted names, friendly names. So you can see that I've got a grid component here that is based on the Northwind orders table. And one of the fields in this order table is order date. And I'm going to go here, and if I run it, we can see that all of the dates right now are displayed using a friendly format as opposed to the actual real date. So, for example, this date over here was Tuesday, the 14th, June 1994. If I go there and choose today instead, you can see it now says today. And the way that this was done was by simply going over to the date picker and specifying that we would like to use a friendly date. If I turn friendly dates off, you can see we go back to just displaying dates in their raw format over there. So we'll go back now to, I must have, what happened over there. Sorry about that. I'm going to just, let's go there. Okay, sorry. Where was I there? So basically, go back to my date over there. So I'm going to turn on friendly dates, and you can see now we have a builder, and you can specify either whether you want a calendar date expressed like this or a relative date expressed like this. So basically, this is calendar dates, and then you can go ahead and you can choose the format of the date, and then you can test how different dates would be formatted. So that's basically explicit dates, but we also have relative dates. So if I go here into the builder right now and then run this, you can see that basically this here is a relative date. It's got today. This date over here says in 1 day. So this is going to basically be a relative date. So it's relative to today's date. If I go there and change that to say today, it says today. If I go there and change it to tomorrow, basically you can see it's in 1 day. If I go there and choose, say, yesterday, it'll say 1 day ago. So the ability to display dates in relative formats is useful in many types of of applications. So now let's go back and take a look at advanced map features. So this is actually not in the release right now, but we are going to be doing another release early next week, and it'll be in this release. So advanced map features is a useful feature for people who are dealing with maps, and specifically who are dealing with routes that need to be displayed on a map. So let's go now to this web project control panel here, and I'll choose the sample component here called map routes. And what you can see we have over here is a list control that has a bunch of addresses, and these addresses define, say, a route. It could be, say, maybe a set of deliveries that a person needs to make, or a set of service calls that a person needs to make. And what I'd like to do is plot this route on the map, get driving directions for each segment of the route, and also then compute the distance and the time for each segment of the map. So I'm going to go ahead there and press the Get Route button. So you can see that we've plotted the route right now. And we've got, for each segment of the route, we have the distance and time. So you can see the first segment is Lexington to Burlington. That's 4.8 miles. It'll take 13 minutes driving. And then here are the directions for that first segment. So there's the first segment, there's the second segment, and there's the third segment. But you can see that I've also implemented on this list here, I've implemented drag reorder. So let's assume that the person who is looking at this app decides that they'd rather go to Western after Lexington before they go to Burlington. So what they can do is they can just press and hold on that row and then just move it up. And as soon as I drop, you'll see that the route gets recalculated and the distances and times get recalculated. Or let's say that I'd like to start my whole exercise in Cambridge. So I'll press and hold on Cambridge and then move that to the very top of the list. And we can see now that basically as soon as I drop that, the route now starts in Cambridge, Massachusetts, over there. So let's go now and take a look at how this was actually done. And this was all done without any coding at all done using Action JavaScript. So you can see that we have our list control, which just has some static data, which has got the addresses. So that's the first segment on the route. That's the second segment, etc. And then we basically have two buttons. This first button called Plot Route, which uses Action JavaScript. So I'll go there. You'll see that we're using a Google Map method, and the method that we're using is called Plot Route. We can plot the route between just 2 points, between a start and end address, or multiple addresses. So we've chosen multiple addresses here. And if you choose multiple addresses, you need to specify a JavaScript function that's going to return an array of all of the addresses. So we're going to specify this JavaScript function called getAddresses. And if we go look at our JavaScript, we can see that getAddresses is a really simple JavaScript function that just gets a pointer to the list control and then loops over all of the data in the list, extracting the address field and putting it into an array. And then we return that array. So when this function here completes, we've computed an array that contains all of the addresses in it. Then the next function, plot distance, is going to basically go ahead and update the distance fields in the list. So you can see right now the distance fields are all blank, but after I hit this button there, they all get filled in the list. So the way that that was done is, you can see we have Action JavaScript, and this time the action that we would like to call is the get distance and travel time between points. And again, just like the route, we can specify either 2 points, a starting and ending point, or multiple points. So we use the same JavaScript function to return the list of addresses. But this function, get distances and time between travel points, is an asynchronous function. In other words, the request is sent to Google to actually compute the distances for us, but it's unknown how long Google will take. And so the function has a callback that gets called once Google has returned the values. So this is the onReady JavaScript function that's going to get called once the data has been computed by Google. So in this function over here, you can see that we have access to an array called data, and we're taking the data that's in data, which has got the travel, the distance between the 2 points, and the duration, the travel time between the 2 points, and we're getting a pointer to the list control, and then we're updating the data in the list and then repopulating the list over there. So there's a little bit of coding going on where we update the list with the values that are returned by this request to the Google map method over there. So the ability to plot routes and plot travel times, etc., and easily rearrange the route is very useful in certain types of applications, what we call dispatch applications. So the final feature that I'd like to talk about is Salesforce integration. So a lot of people are using Salesforce right now, and the ability to easily get Salesforce data into Alpha and to also update Salesforce data from within Alpha is a powerful feature that builds on top of Alpha's REST API integration. So let's start out by seeing how this would actually be done. So you can see, I'm going to just bring my browser onto the screen over here. And this is my Salesforce account here. I'm logged into my Salesforce account. And the first thing that you need to do when you want to basically access Salesforce data from within Alpha, or frankly from within any third-party program, is you need to go into Salesforce. You need to go into the App Manager section over here and create what's called a new connected application. So this is where you're going to basically give a third-party application like Alpha Anywhere permission to access your Salesforce account. So you can see we've created a new connected application here called Alpha Anywhere Test. And if we go ahead now and we edit this connected application definition, you can see now that what we have is from Salesforce, we get what's called the consumer secret, the consumer key, and then there's also the consumer secret. These are like the sort of credentials for my Salesforce account. And then we also have basically, we can define a bunch of callback URLs. And these are the URLs that Salesforce will use to call back into your Alpha application after you have completed the authentication. So typically what happens in an Alpha application, you'd have a button to log into Salesforce. That would bring up the Salesforce login screens. And when you've successfully authenticated, Salesforce would call back into your Alpha Anywhere application. So once you've created your connected application in Alpha, you can then go, in Salesforce, you can then go into Alpha and create what are called named resources. So you'll see here, for example, if I go to the web control panel and then go to named resources here, I've got a whole bunch of named resources that I've previously defined. And if I were to go, say, and edit this named resource, you can see here that I've got my consumer key and then also my consumer secret and a bunch of other things that define this connection to Salesforce. And so you can think of a named resource as similar to a connection string to connect to a SQL database. So once you've got a named resource, you can then basically log in and then interact with Salesforce. So I can go, for example, over here to this named resource over there, and let's go there and actually log in so that I can test it in my development environment. So now basically we're at the Salesforce login screen. So I'll go here and type in my credentials. And then hit login. Now I have two-factor authentication turned on for Salesforce. So I've just received a text message on my phone. So I'm going to type in the code that was sent to me, 78684. Hit verify. Now Salesforce is asking me to approve the request that Alpha Anywhere has made to access my Salesforce account. I'm going to say allow it, and you can see now basically we've logged into Salesforce. We can now interact with Salesforce in working preview and in development because we now have authenticated against that. So now that I've basically got my Salesforce token all set up, I can build a connection string to Salesforce in the same way that I would build a connection string to a, say, SQL database. So I'll go here and say new. I'll call this Salesforce demo. Then I'll go into the connection string builder, and I'll choose Salesforce. I'll choose the named resource that I've just defined. So I'll go ahead and click OK, and then click OK. So now I have a new connection string called Salesforce demo, and let's call this Salesforce demo 2. Click OK, close it. And now I'm going to go basically and build a grid component, just like I would build a grid against any SQL database. So I'll go over there to Web Components, choose Grid. I'll choose an updatable grid, and go there and choose Salesforce Demo 2. Click Connect, hit Select, and now these are all of the objects in my Salesforce account. So you can see that we're treating Salesforce as though it were just like any other database. So these are all of the tables in my Salesforce account. So I'll go ahead there and choose, say, Account. Go over to my field list, and I'll choose ID, Name, Billing State, Billing City, Billing State, and Billing Country. Go there and then save this, Salesforce Grid 1. Hit the Save button. Go over now to run this, and you can see now we have our grid component displaying data from Salesforce, and I can just go there and make an update and then submit that basically back. And now we've actually made an update directly against Salesforce, treating it as if it were a database. But you can also interact with Salesforce directly through the Salesforce API. So if you go into Salesforce and you go to the Salesforce API documentation, you can see that these are all of the objects over here. So we're not, right now we're looking at Salesforce documentation. And if I go, for example, to account, I can see that the Salesforce API allows me to create an account, delete an account, etc. And it shows me what the, for any one of these actions, basically it shows me what the URL is, whether it's a post or a get, etc. And it shows me the syntax. So within Alpha, we have a helper function that makes it very easy to make REST API calls directly against the Salesforce API. So if we go over here and we look at some sample code here, you can see we have a helper function called Salesforce API request. And the arguments to this function are the name of the named resource that has your credentials. So you can see I'm using a named resource called Salesforce token. And then I can either specify the endpoint that I would like to hit or the query that I would like to execute that uses Salesforce SQL syntax. So here I'm going to basically hit this endpoint to fetch information about a particular Salesforce account identified by that ID over there. So I'll go ahead and run it. And you can see that there's the data that was returned by this Salesforce API helper function. So the Salesforce API helper function makes it very easy to make requests against the Salesforce API, especially once you've gone ahead and defined a named resource, etc. And the named resource basically takes care of all of the OAuth authentication flows that you would need to go through in order to connect to Salesforce. So I can see now that we're kind of pretty much out of time, so I'd like to stop now, and then if there are any questions from anybody, I'd like to take some time to answer those questions.
Excellent. Well, let's start with a pretty simple one, which is, can data go both ways for Salesforce integration? Can you pull data out and put data back into Salesforce using this?
Absolutely. In fact, I think that's what I showed here. I went into this grid here,
Uh-huh.
and I did an update against Salesforce. So that was basically treating Salesforce as if it were a SQL database, and I can do all of the CRUD operations, updates, inserts, deletes, and queries. But I can also basically make calls, direct calls against the Salesforce API. So if I wanted to create a new account, for example, then I would go to the Salesforce documentation, find out what the syntax is for creating an account. And so you can see here the syntax for creating an account is this endpoint. It's a post, and then the post body contains the information that you want to send. So basically, so you can use the Salesforce documentation to find out exactly what you need to do, and then you can make that call directly from Alpha.
Excellent. So going back to APIs, we had a couple of questions there. One question is, can the APIs, you've shown an example using it consuming JSON, but can it consume XML using this new system?
Yes, because what the API is doing is just simply making available a function that you wrote in the Xbasic to the REST API. So your Xbasic function does all the work, and you can write that function any way you want. So you could basically write your function to return XML data. You can write your function to consume XML data. It's completely up to you. JSON, there's nothing special about JSON. We just use JSON because it's such a common data interchange format. But you can basically generate and consume XML data in your API just as easily as you generate and consume JSON data.
That's great. Now, at the very beginning of your presentation, you showed API stuff, and you were using, I believe, Swagger showed up in the URL. Can you tell people a little bit about Swagger and what we've done with it in Alpha Anywhere?
Okay, that's a great question. So basically, one of the things about REST APIs is that there's no formal definition of what a REST API is supposed to do, like there is for SOAP services. For a SOAP service, you've got basically the WSDL, which defines what the SOAP service is. But for REST APIs, there's no formal definition. So a lot of different people have tried to formalize the definition of how a REST API should be described, and Swagger has emerged as sort of the de facto standard. So Swagger is a way of describing a REST API. And in Alpha, we can both consume and generate Swagger definitions. So for example, if I go back to the web control panel and look at the API that I previously created, you can see here's the API that we created. If I say Swagger definition, this is actually going to show the Swagger definition of my API. So this is a definition that is an open source definition that other programs would also understand. But not only can you generate Swagger definitions from the APIs that you define in Alpha, but you can also create new APIs from a Swagger definition. So for example, if I go over here to web services and I say create a new REST service, and you can see now that I'm starting from a blank web service, and I'd like to import a Swagger definition. So let's say that somebody else, maybe in the IT department or something, has gone ahead and defined an API and given me a Swagger definition. I can go ahead here and import it and paste that Swagger definition over here, or I can import a sample definition. So this sample that I'm importing over here comes from the Swagger website. It's their so-called pet store definition. And I can say that take this definition of this API and generate either an Xbasic class or a Node API for me. If I'd like to implement this API using Node, I can do that. But I'm going to just choose Xbasic, so I'll go ahead and say import. And you can see now basically what's happened behind the scenes is Alpha has taken that Swagger definition, and if I go ahead now, and it's also created a class called Swagger Pet Store Xbasic. So I'll just go ahead and save that, cancel, and now go over to Xbasic. And we can see now that if I look here, this is the class that got generated automatically for me from that Swagger definition. So you'll see that there's a whole bunch of methods in this class, but all of the methods right now are just stub methods. So it's up to me to actually write the code that implements the actual work that each method needs to do. So hopefully that explains sort of the relevance of Swagger and how Alpha both consumes and generates Swagger definitions.
It does. Thank you very much. There are other questions that we weren't able to get to because we've run out of time, but if you want to send those questions to guides, Guides, at alphasoftware.com, we would be happy to answer them. Also, if there are particular topics that you think you'd like to see covered in a future webinar, especially inspired by what Selwyn has shown us today, by all means, send those also to guides at alphasoftware.com, and we'll be happy to put together some presentations for you. So Selwyn, thank you very much for presenting today. I know there was a lot of interest, and a lot of people have said a lot of nice things here in the questions section. And I'd like to thank everyone who also asked questions during that session. So we will see you next Wednesday back here at the Alpha Anywhere Demo and Q&A webcast. Until then, thanks very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dave.